Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another of the monthly meetings of the Libertarian Alliance. We meet here, or next door,
hopefully not next door.
once a month. Tonight's speaker is David McDonagh, who is normally chairman, and I'm an occasional speaker. But tonight I'm the chairman because he, on this occasion, is the speaker. His topic is, was Adam Smith right about slavery?
Yes, indeed. That's not the answer, but that's the topic. That's the topic.
Question mark.
No, I'll delay the answer.
Just give me a yes or no, we can get to the part.
Basically, this topic of it's not Adam Smith so much as the criticism of Adam Smith from Robert William Fogel, who died on the 11th of June last year, and he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1993 for more or less, I suppose, refuting Adam Smith, really, all the economists on slavery, and showing that slavery is tremendously profitable and so on. So the question arises whether he did really refute Adam Smith. That is indeed I suppose, the topic of the talk. But let's have a look at a little bit about, a very small amount about him to begin with. He was a Marxist in the 1940s after the war, and he was also politically correct. And I've been thinking about this over the last few days. Well, you know that I do constant meditations on political correctness, which I hate like the very devil. One of my friends said, do you like, when it comes to the PC, is it the personal computer or the political correctness that you hate most? Both. I said both. Both are sources of frustration. But anyway, no wonder my personal computer won't work for me. I don't ever get a slave to work for me or anything like that. But anyway, the political correctness. And thinking of it, the outsider looks at the Church of England and considers it completely politically correct. Or he might look at the Marxists and see they're completely politically correct, and so on. But I suppose that having in common with the author, he was a Marxist in the 1940s, but I was a Marxist in the 1960s, and there was indeed in the Marxist Party a number of politically correct people, and I was uneasy about it. I didn't have my current animosity towards it, but I was uneasy about it. And I suppose that even in the LA there are a certain number of political correct people, and an outsider might see there has been more politically correct people in the LA than actually what there is. So this politically correct is kind of, it seems to be everywhere, really, and other people will think that it dominates in those places, but it probably doesn't. My personal experience is that it didn't dominate the socialist group I was in, and it doesn't dominate the LA as far as I can see, but I should imagine there are a few politically correct people in the LA, and there certainly was in the Socialist Party. And there seems to be, to me, a superabundance of them in the Church of England. But anyway, he after a bit, he got to see Marxism as unscientific. Now, he does have, over the years, he has developed an odd, he did develop an odd, well, not so odd really, view of science. He not so odd really, because it's not so abnormal as you might think, but I think it is the minority view. And that is, he rejected positivism. So that meant that he rejected the fact-value distinction. So that means that he did have the idea that moral things could be good objectively. In other words, the question of whether slavery was bad or not is an objective thing. Now, it might be an objective thing, even if you accept the fact-value distinction. I mean, I personally think that it's fairly objective that slavery was bad, in spite of the fact that I accept the fact-value distinction. Because I think that there is an ontology of morals as well as of facts. But nevertheless, he did think that, he did hold that the view of science was just book knowledge. In other words, he thought that history was just as good as science as physics on this viewpoint. And this viewpoint is quite common in France, I believe, certainly among French writers. And I guess perhaps even in Germany, certainly among German writers. So this is and it's often called the continental, the LA? It's often called the continental view of science, although of course the fact-value distinction is the Vienna Circle, I suppose, in Austria is the home of the fact value distinction, and so that's that can be equally called continental, although it might be associated with David Hume, who's British, and a lot of British thinkers like John Stuart Mill, people like that. But anyway, so that's his view of science. He considers history to be a science, and morals to be a science, ethics to be a science, and so on. Book knowledge. I thought, but anyway, a little bit more about him. He was so politically correct that he was determined to make a positive stance against racism. And his main positive stance, when he was very young, he decided to limit himself to certainly marry a negress. So he limited his, he found a wife among the negresses, which you can do. I mean, if this is similar to what rich, very pretty girls do when they're looking for a husband. They limit their catch to a millionaire. And they said you've got plenty of choices among the various millionaires, so presumably you've got plenty of choices among the various negresses. But anyway, he married a negress, and he says a number of times throughout this book, and presumably throughout his others, that he writes these books to explain slavery, American slavery, to his sons. Well, of course, his sons are, of course, the children also of his wife, and so they have an interest in it. They'll be half-castes, I guess. So they'll have an interest in it. He will hope that they might disappoint him, of course. Children always do disappoint you. They might not have an interest in slavery at all, but still, there you are. That's his quest. And so he remained faithful to political correctness, but he thought that Marxism was bunk. However, he did think that there was, I suppose this goes along with political correctness and argument with Marxism, he did think that capitalism was evil and bad thing, and that it pushed down living standards and so on. And he is remarkable. There are a lot of remarkable things in this book without consent or contract, and he's seeing slavery as being far more profitable than certainly what the economists expected it to be, and certainly what he expected it to be as well when he started out. And these haven't been welcome facts to him, but he's been so much pushing this line of slavery pays that a lot of people who are also politically correct have come into his lectures and accused him of being pro-slavery. Well, of course, he's not pro-slavery, not a bit of it, but that's what they've accused him of being, simply because he's accepted these various facts, as it were, independently of his will, that slavery is very profitable. Now, he did, sorry.
What is the guy's name?
Sorry, it's Robert William Fogel. Sorry, I thought I made that clear earlier. Sorry about that.
That's the he.
That is the he all the time. Robert William Fogel. This is the book. This is the main book. So Robert William Fogel.
Sorry, he would explain political correctness at another lecture.
Well, it is just a certain amount of the idea that you mustn't discriminate on the basis of race or sex, or everyone's really equal. It's basically the idea of equality, and it especially hates discrimination like the very devil. So that's basically politically correctness.
Now we know.
So it's not a personal computer. But anyway, he as a Marxist, he probably in common with me thought that Smith's view was just a version of the materialist interpretation of history, that capitalism, because Marxists do look on capitalism as a problem solver. That in fact it is capitalism that's going to introduce socialism. That's basically what Marxists think. So capitalism is going to solve all the problems, sometimes in a nasty way, but then it's going to make the world right for socialism, and then we're just going to take over and have socialism. That's basically the Marxist view. So the big thing that Robert William Fogel had a look at, and it is a shot across. I mean, as soon as I picked up the book and started seeing this fact, it was a shot across my bows as well. I thought, bloody hell, am I going to be able to defend Adam Smith on this one? Because what happened after Smith was dead, Smith died in the 1790s, is that slavery expanded. Now, if the positive version of what Smith says is correct, then of course why should slavery expand in the 19th century? If anything, and if the materialist conception of history is right, the Marxist theory is right, that capitalism is there's a difference between capitalism and slavery. Although the Marxists often call work wage slavery, that's just an oxymoron that they use in propaganda. They don't actually think it's wage slavery. They think there's a difference between free labour and slave labour, and that's essential to their outlook, because slave labour, according to Marx, was the main paradigm of ancient Rome. It was replaced by serfdom, which is an advance, according to Marx, in the Middle Ages, and here in capitalism it's replaced by free labour. And these are different modes of production, according to Marx, which is essential to materialist conception of history, or the materialist interpretation of history. So it is. I think the growth of slavery in the 18th century is an anomaly, if not a refutation of Marxism, of the materialist conception of history. I think that is true, and it is a bit. When you look at that, you don't find, you're looking at other things. You don't look at this. This is now. Is that in itself a refutation of Adam Smith? It's reproduced by Marx and by others. In fact, Marx goes along with the whole paradigm. In fact, Fogel must have maybe founded in Marx that the slave power was uneconomic, and that it couldn't compete with free labour. And Marx was very happy with the idea that, which Smith certainly introduced in The Wealth of Nations, that it wasn't a moral matter that got rid of slavery, that morals were irrelevant, that it was economics that got rid of slavery. And in other words, it's capitalism that gets rid of slavery, not morals. Now, Fogel has come to the view that it is indeed morals that got rid of slavery. Not only that, he even thinks it's Christianity that got rid of slavery, and that it's especially evangelical Christianity. He thinks he thinks if it wasn't for all that, we'd still have slavery in America now, and he thinks it would have expanded because he thinks it is fantastically more efficient than free labour. That's his thesis, and he thinks that it was what happened is that you had the growth of slavery in the 7th century in the islands of the Mediterranean, down the coast of Africa, and these, oddly enough, to begin with, I remember I did some business studies and some students from all over the world in the business studies class, and I pointed out to them that the vast majority of slaves were from Central Europe, and this was a revelation to them. One girl came from Brazil, and she was convinced that only slaves were blacks. This is a kind of we've got the idea that only slaves are black because we just don't know any history, and we've been focusing so much on the United States. But of course, it's true that slaves were generally black in the United States, but most of the Slavs, of course, in the European countries, the suffix the Slavs is Czechoslovakia. That is an indication that the slave population of Slavs are a version of slave, and most of the slaves from Constantinople and Rome, of course, came from Germany and Eastern and Western Europe. And to begin with, when slavery started up in the production of sugar in the Mediterranean, it was indeed with white slaves. But then, and indeed, in the Civil War, a lot of slaves were captured from Ireland. They were settled in the West Indies. So the first West Indian slaves were white slaves as well. Which is one reason why so many American boxers who have come from the West Indies have got names like McCallum and so on, Irish names, because they took the names of the Irish who they replaced as slaves when they were, but then what happened is that the African slave trade was tapped. I mean, it had been going in Africa, slavery, various wars. What happens basically, mainly with slavery, is that you have a war, then prisoners of war are taken and they're sold off as slaves. And this was going on in Africa, it was going on under Rome, it was going on under Constantinople and so on, and even John Locke, the founder of liberalism, not only a liberal though, he was also a Unitarian Christian, actually thought that slavery was justified because if the chap was captured, he'd had taken a prisoner of war status rather than lose his life. Therefore, he can't really complain. And Locke does say if he doesn't like slavery, he can always commit suicide. So that's Locke's justification. Now, I don't know whether that's to do with liberalism or to do with religion, his Christian religion. I tend to think the latter, as I'll explain later on. But anyway, so that's... So what happened is that once they tapped this African slave trade, there was plenty of wars going on in Africa then, as there are today, sadly, and so plenty of slaves were on tap from becoming prisoners of war and being sold off. And they tapped this first, and they soon replaced all the Mediterranean sugar islands with slaves. Now, the gang system, Fogel says, which he thinks is tremendously more efficient than free labour, was first developed, he thinks, even by the whites in the Mediterranean, by the white slaves in the Mediterranean. And it was adopted by the black slaves. And basically what it is the master just serves out, he gets the population, he just has a look at what he thinks they can do, and he fits them to various jobs. And he makes sure they do these jobs and so on. And he gets them to cooperate together, and eventually he gets one of them to lead the gang, and so the slave driver, who's usually a slave himself. And they work in teams, and it's usually like, Fogel likens it to Ford's production line. They keep going at a pretty efficient rate, and they learn labour discipline and so on. And he thinks this is tremendously efficient. And this then spread, the gang system then spread, not to all slave plantations, but certainly it was suited to some more than others. But it certainly went to sugar. Now, it went eventually to cotton as well. But sugar largely kept out by an interesting statistic, by the way. As I said earlier on, we do actually think a lot of the United States when we think of slavery. But of course, if we have a look at as Fogel says, if we have a look at the 10 billion slaves going across the Atlantic, remember the slaves were sold from Africa were sold in Europe and the Mediterranean and so on before Columbus went to America. It went from about 1400 onwards, so almost 90 or so years before Columbus went to America. So there was a lot of slaves from Africa and in these Mediterranean islands, and also in the islands down the Canaries and islands down there, down the side of Africa, were all slave islands, and they're all planted with sugar by the Portuguese and the Spanish. And what happened? They found a new world, and they sent the gangs over there, the gang system over there, especially in sugar. Now, sugar largely kept out of America. Now, out of 10 million people shipped across the Atlantic, more was shipped out of Africa, but 10 million was shipped across the Atlantic, one way or the other. Only 7% of those ever went to the lands which are now called the USA. Only 7% is rather surprised, I think. The biggest recipient of slaves was the single biggest recipient of slaves was Brazil, which received 41% of those slaves. And then together, all the various islands of the West Indies and the French and British West Indian islands, they got all of them. They got 47% of these slaves. But they counted separate. They counted separate islands rather than Brazil as a in that. But so you could say that the West Indies as a whole had more than Brazil, if you want to, it'd be true. but anyhow, so that's rather surprising. And about 7% or so elsewhere. But so that's the end of the 10 million, about 10 million of them. In fact, he says he does say 9 billion 900,000. 10 billion he means roughly, approximately 10 billion.
Billion or million, David?
So I've rounded up, pardon?
Was that billion or million?
It's US billion, so it's milliard.
Oh, I see.
No, hold on, sorry. The numbers of slaves? We're talking about millions.
10
We're talking about millions.
million, yes, millions, yes, you're right. It's not milliard.
10,000.
Yes,
No.
millions, yes, you're quite right. That's a big mistake, sorry.
Yeah.
I get confused about these numbers, sadly. So it's 10 million. Yes, 10 million. Now, he does say that in America they had a better survival rate. And he puts this down to the fact that they were, that America earlier on outlawed the international slave trade. Around about 1805, they outlawed the international slave. There's still internal buying and selling of trade, but and that's one of the reasons why I think they didn't adopt sugar as well, because sugar was a harsh business and ate up the lives of many slaves and so on, but harsh conditions. And sugar didn't really. It did get going in a few places in Louisiana, but it didn't really get on its feet before 1805, and they stopped the international trade, and so and they had to buy then internal slaves, which were a bit more expensive. So he does think that this gang system is highly efficient and highly adaptable. Although it's not so suitable for tobacco, it is suitable for sugar, cotton, and many other. And it was the main source, especially in cotton in the USA. And he thinks this is one of. Now he points out that the slave trade soon made use of new machinery like steam and so on. They were, and he thinks this is because the slaves. I ought to have before you the actual. I haven't given an outline of the actual Smith, Marx, Mises idea of slavery, which is really Marx and Mises rather than Smith's, as I'll make clear later on. But that is that free labour and slave labour are have no chance against each other. The free labour will win every time, mainly because of lack of incentives. This is the main thing that Smith does say this, lack of incentives. In fact, Smith says everything that Marx and Mises repeats. It's just the other things that Smith says. Everything bar the fact. Smith doesn't say that free labour is going to drive out slave labour. He doesn't ever say that. Marx says that, and Mises says that, and a lot of other people say that. A lot of other liberals, Carnes, for example, says that. That free labour is going to try. Now, Fogel's got the idea that if left to themselves without the intervention of morals, the state and religion, the other thing would happen, i.e. slave labour, is so efficient that it would drive out free labour, so much more productive that it would drive out free labour. And so therefore, he thinks that the Civil War had to be fought. If it hadn't, then if the South had broken away, the South would have become stronger than the North. It would have probably brought up the slave islands and expanded into slave power, and it would probably have brought up the North by now as well. And you'd have slavery would be big in the world today. That's more or less as he sees it. He says it because so he bases his ideas on the idea that there is a very strong labour discipline problem with free labour, and he goes a lot on the chap that Marx quotes a lot, Andrew. I'd like to get hold of this Andrew. I've been reading the quotations from him for ages.
Who's it?
Andrew. That's U-E-R. Sorry, U-R-E. Sorry, beg your pardon. Ewer. Andrew Ewer. Beg your pardon. Andrew Ewer. Andrew Ewer is quoted by Fogel, and he says that people are they won't come in, they won't come in on Monday mornings, they won't work, there's tremendous labour discipline job in the factory, you can't get them, and all this. And Ewer actually says that he definitely thinks that once a person is over 30, he'll never adapt to factory life or to modern industrial life. I think this is a bit of hyperbole. But anyhow, that's what, and Fogel takes this on board. That a strong labour discipline. He says there's no apart from the fact that they're using immoral force, which he agrees with us, as it were, with the liberal position, that it is immoral to use force on these people. Nevertheless, if you grant that immoral force, then slavery is very efficient at labour discipline and so on. But he also says that other people have Smith certainly, and Marx and Mises and so on, overrated the problem of incentives and underrated the masters' ability to solve this. He thinks that the masters, with their knowledge of the character of the slaves and so on, can provide incentives. And he also quotes William Cobbett, who cited that the working men of it, Charles Dickens said much the same thing, and so did Carlyle and Ruskin, that workers had poorer paid and poorer conditions than the slaves of the United States and south of the United States have. He says that's right. The conditions for slavery was better. And he says that this more or less made him, shook him a bit, shook his values a bit, because if it is so, if conditions are better under slavery, then it's probably not so bad as he thought at first, but he still was against slavery, of course. He never was. Fogel never was for a moment in favour of slavery. So slavery is efficient. It's paying the slaves more. They're having better conditions. They're allowed to develop their own culture a lot more than what was thought. They're allowed to, the working hours are shorter for slaves than there are for free labour. In the 6 decades from 1800 to 1860, he has the idea that the slaves average 58 hours a week, whereas the free labour had to average 72 hours a week. So he's really building up a picture here. Let's have a look first of all, because there is a clash between Fogel and Smith over this incentive thing, which is certainly part of Smith and part of Mises and Marx, of course. So there is a real problem there, whether he's right on this economics thing. But first of all, let me outline what Adam Smith actually said. Remember that Fogel's solution to slavery was morals, religion, and politics, and eventually he wanted it outlawed. The final bottom line was that Fogel thinks slavery can only be outlawed. He thinks this because slavery is tremendously popular, tremendously profitable. He takes to heart. He cites a funny citation from him. He cites a chap called George Fitzhugh, who actually thinks that slavery is far better than free labour. And there is one passage he cites from him which has a sort of contradiction that I don't think Fogel notices, where Fitzhugh says, we look after our slaves, we give them everything, they have a nice family, they love us, we love them, and so on. He paints a rosy picture of slavery. And Fitzhugh says, I don't think this is a racial thing. Fitzhugh says, I think the whites in the north will be far better off as slaves as they are now, as free labour. He says, just have a look at them there. He starts criticising the north, in New York and so on. He says they are going into those gambling dens, and then he says, and this is the contradiction, I think, in Fitzhugh, which Fogel seems to overlook. He says, they're slaves to those gambling dens, which I think is because he's recommending slavery. He said they're slaves to the gambling dens, but still, that's anyhow. I'd like to get some more. I've only read the quotations from Fitzhugh, but I'd like to get hold of his books. The book is called Sociology for the South, 1854. I'd love to get hold of it. In fact, I intend to get hold of it and read it. It should be a stream, where he recommends slavery as one big family, And oddly enough, sometimes when you're reading through some of this, you kind of have a Gestalt switch. Perhaps this is not so different from advocating the Soviet Union. Suddenly you think that. But anyhow, it's just a passing thought. But let me have a look at what Smith actually said on slavery. So he does start off with saying that the Mises Marx thing, that free labour is far more efficient than slave labour. And slave labour, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink. This is Smith, more or less. He doesn't say that adage, but the adage fits what he's saying. There's no way you can solve the problem of incentive and so on. What you need to do is he says the main problem with slavery is they won't allow the slaves to have their own property. If you allowed the slave to have his own property, then perhaps you could give him more. But he says Smith actually thinks that this is how slavery in Rome actually did dwindle into serfdom, and serfdom itself dwindled into free labour, because the master could see that it's inefficient. They need to allow these people to have their own property. Smith says of serfdom, he says that at first it was a different sort of slavery from the actual Roman slavery, that you had the men tied to the land. So the man could only sell the slaves if he sold the land as well. He didn't really own the slaves directly, he owned the land, and the serfs were more or less tied to the land. And so he says, but still he said the courts also gave the serfs some protection, which they didn't give the slaves, particularly in Rome and Constantinople. And he said that if a man murdered a slave, he may even face the death penalty for it. So the serfs had some, but he says they didn't have any property. They but they were allowed property, but the baron could take any of their property and it wouldn't be theft. In other words, they had no protection from law for their property. But he said that this business of the baron's right to take whatever is owned by any of his serfs gradually faded. And he says in Western Europe, in my day, where I live, Scotland, Smith was writing, and in Britain, basically in Western Europe, it's now free labour, serfdom was just happening. But he says in Eastern Europe, it's still roughly the same as it was back then. You've still got in Russia and so on, this serfdom, which is, the people are tied to the land. So then he goes on to say, he says, because Smith, it's often said, Smith hated, or didn't like anyway, the capitalists or the masters. He didn't like them very much. He wasn't in favour of the capitalists or the masters. He always thought they were out to cheat the public. And he said the masters absolutely love slavery and they hate free labour. They love free labour, slavery. They would much prefer free labour to slavery any day. And so this is the reason why we have slavery. This was his apology for why we had slavery at all in his day, because it's so inferior to free labour, according to Smith. The reason why is because in production of some crops like sugar, and to a lesser extent tobacco, the demand was so great that the money was coming in that the master could afford to maintain slavery. And so it's the reverse of what Fogel would say, or Fogel refers to this, but it isn't that slave production is efficient, it is that the prop can afford to have inefficient production because it's paying so well, because it's in such a... and he said now I don't think he said the master so loves domination. He says this is a bit similar to the people in Parliament and the imperialism and war. They so love war and this sort of thing that they'll pay for it through the nose, no matter how uneconomic it is. They don't care that it's uneconomic. They can afford. They're in a position where they can tax people and have what is uneconomic. So Smith's answer to this is the free market. Is that, but he doesn't think the free market will ever get rid of it and he especially thinks the Parliament won't get rid of it because the masters are in Parliament and they love that sort of thing. So don't depend on Parliament to get rid of slavery because that'll be full of... But what you can depend on, and he goes back, he says, what you can depend on is the king, who doesn't like the barons to get too powerful. So he will side with the serfs and give the serfs some rights and be fair. And he says also the church, he quotes Alexander III in the 7th century, who issues a papal bull outlawing slavery completely in the 7th century. And and Smith says this is wonderful. He's got rid of slavery completely, except that he just made it as a pious exhortation instead of carrying the penalty of excommunication. Smith reckons that if Alexander III, the Pope, had carried the penalty of excommunication, that would have been the end of the road for slavery. But he definitely does think that where you don't get slavery is where it is outlawed. And he says sometimes some kings do outlaw it in order to encourage, to get rid of the power, to cut the power of the masters. Because so he expects, Smith expects the end of slavery to come, if it ever comes at all, through the forces of the church and the state in the form of a king. But if you get a more democratic state where you have a measure of democracy where the masters get into Parliament, then it's the masters love slavery so much that if anything that'll consolidate it rather than get rid of it. So those views are ironically rather like Fogel's views, except 200 years beforehand. So Smith didn't think that free labour would crowd out slave labour. He thought that when it could be afforded, it would be afforded in certain crops. But he did think that it was catastrophically uneconomic. So insofar as so we still do have the conflict between Fogel and Smith in this small section of what. But as we can see, I think it's very clear from what I've said, most of what Smith says and what Fogel says is in common as regards getting rid of slavery. It is the law, finally, that does it. It'll have to be outlawed. Now, Fogel says it's morals. Now, there is a problem with this, because morals, I mean, I don't know whether you've ever read the history of morals. I have. I've read a number of them. What is amazing is how little morals have changed in the last 2,500 years. what you get is a highlighting of certain things. But I think morals are roughly the same now as they were 2,500 years ago when old Aristotle was writing on his book of ethics, or even before then, basically don't steal, don't hit the person virtuously unless he's hit you or something. That's gonna, in other words, it is basically almost the Libertarian alliance. Don't hit other people and don't steal after them, don't lie to them, and so on. It's basically just, and I think a lot of people have there's been certain fads to make certain other things part of morals, which I think are rather confusions. But I think morals are roughly the same as they've always been. But certainly there is the problem of why if morals are against slavery, Fogel's got a lot of problems with that. Why why was slavery only unpopular just lately? I think the answer to this is that it isn't just morals that is against. I mean, it is moral. I mean, right. I do think slavery is immoral, but why? Why do I think that now, whereas I probably wouldn't if I'd been born 500 years ago? I think the answer to that is the Enlightenment. It is the Enlightenment in the tail end of the 18th century, not religion, but the Enlightenment that condemns morality by bringing to the fore the liberal idea, the idea that men should be free. And if men should be free is a moral proposition, then men being slaves is evil. So slavery becomes an evil because of the liberal idea, because of the rise of the liberal idea, and the liberal idea arose in the Enlightenment. Now, let's have a look at this. Let's have a quick look at because Fogel says it's religion, and it's especially the evangelicals. But he agrees with Smith that in a democracy you've got to lie and cheat, and you can't be faithful to your principles, to your anti-slavery principles. There's got to be a lot of compromise and so on in democracy because of one thing and another. And he tends to agree with Smith that a parliamentary thing makes things less smooth. He just wants the church, but ironically he does say that for once it did get political, then it was on the road to success. So that's a bit of an irony. For once, the people like the great Garrison, isn't it? The great anti-abolitionists in the United States were for keeping it out of politics, and Fogel more or less agrees with that because he thinks it is morals that's going to be the road to get rid of slavery. But he has to admit that for once he does go into politics, he does get a move on, and that's strange. But so actually, I was going through the. So actually, whether is Christianity opposed to slavery? So I was just going to run through the debate up till the Civil War in America, where two lots of Bible bashers had it out over the Bible over slavery. Now, this is that's almost a joke. The abolitionists said they had the spirit of the Bible, but when they come to the actual text of the Bible, of course, the slave owners had it hands down. They could quote from various texts of Leviticus and the Exodus and other texts in the Old Testament, as where the Bible endorses slavery, and then in the New Testament they could Paul in one epistle, the epistle of Philomenus, he actually tells the slave to go back to the master. The slave owner said, well, there's plenty of room to explicitly condemn slavery in the Bible, but he never does it. When it actually does come to it, he actually endorses it. But the abolitionists said, well, we have the spirit of the Bible on our side, but the spirit didn't seem to give them a ghost of a chance when it comes to looking at the texts. So they lost hands down. So it wasn't so much. So I think it is morals, but it isn't the Christian morals that did it. Although it was what people thought were Christian morals, because they thought they were quoting the spirit of Christianity. And I think an explanation is needed for this. People credit Christianity with all sorts of things, They treated it with the institution of marriage, upholding the institution of marriage. They treated it with introducing morals into civilization and so on. But in actual fact, if you have a look at the facts of the matter, most trained theologians may well have read Plato's Euthyro, which says that there's a difference between might and right, and that God can't make the right, and therefore, if God exists, the question arises: is God good or bad? In other words, there's a difference between theology and ethics. They're different. They're quite different things, and might is not right, and so it so happens that if you have a look at what people take to be Christian morals today, they are actually bourgeois morals. They are the ordinary morals that we might know. But if you have a look at the actual early Christians, they weren't concerned with morals at all, because they thought the end was nigh. They thought we were near the end of the world. There's no need for morals. The world won't be around for much longer, in the last days. So therefore then, there is no Christian morals. What's happened is that we credit Christianity with morals, but we credit it with bourgeois morals, and bourgeois morals, of course, are liberal morals, not Christian morals. So I think it is. I think Fogel's right that it is morals that condemn slavery, but it's not Christian morals. It is actually liberal morals. Now let's come to the knotty problem of which is in fact the economic problem. And now Fogel quite rightly takes one view of economics. If something exists, then it will have an economics. I mean, even if it's catastrophically uneconomic. From anyone's point of view. If you take war, for example, war is certainly a negative-sum game. It doesn't pay, in itself, it doesn't pay. Many people think that's false, because otherwise you wouldn't have war. Fogel was probably one of them people who think that. But in actual fact, it's a negative-sum game. There's destruction on both sides insofar as the war goes on. It cannot pay. But people have it because they pay extra for it. They have taxation and so on, which actually is a waste of money in that particular war, and so on. And so anything that exists has an economics. That's true. War has an economics. Slavery has an economics. Crime has an economics. Someone makes a living out of crime. There's an economics of that. However, that doesn't mean that it's economic in the other sense, namely whether it pays or not. Now, if we count all, if we take the liberal idea on board, the bourgeois idea on board, if you like, or today's common idea that we should all be free on board, and we count the slaves as ends in themselves, as Kant would have done, Immanuel Kant would have done, we count everyone's ends. We have to ask whether whether with free labour, of course, we can see I work. Receive my wages no matter how low or how high, because I enter into it voluntary, which means I'm more or less I'm getting something out of it. We can say it's a positive sum game. I'm gaining from the employment no matter how badly it pays me, and that they're gaining from employing me no matter how well they pay me. They pay me a lot. They're still gaining from this. With slavery, you can't do that because it's forced. So you're ignoring the values of the slaves. Now, under those conditions, these are questions which I think Fogel has not asked, because he hasn't asked himself what is economic. Under those conditions, can we say that slavery was ever economic? And I think that the answer is there's an old joke. There's a joke where perhaps with George Fitz you in mind, a slave, runaway slave, was caught in the north and was put on trial. And the judge said, "Now, did your master treat you badly?" He says, "No, sir, he treated me very well. I had all the food that I wanted." He says, "Did you go short of clothing?" He says, "No, I had wonderful clothing, splendid clothing. It was wonderful." He says, "Plenty of leisure?" He says, "Yes, lots of leisure. Didn't work you too hard?" "No." He said, "Well, why didn't you take that job then? Why have you run away?" He says, "Master, the job's still open if you want it."
Thank you, David. That might have to be your conclusion.
Oh, sorry. I'll just sum up by a sentence.
All right,
I don't think that he's right on his central thesis, namely that what I've called in this lecture the Marx-Mises thesis of part of Smith is right. We haven't had time to discuss it. I've done such a bad job. I apologise for that. But I do think that's where he's strongest. But I don't think that he is, although he got the Nobel Prize for economics, I don't think he finally knew what economics was. But he was a good lad, and this is a good book. So I recommend it.
Well, I have to read it now. Thank you, David. Right, I'll ask the first question because it's just occurred to me. I thought you were... so the answer was Smith was right.
Yes.
Oh, very good. That's now we know.
So I asked it right away. Thanks for coming.
But you seem to be saying at one point that he didn't pay, but then you seem to say, given that certain crops only grow here, and given that slavery was used to grow those crops there, they could get such prices for their crops they could afford the wastefulness of using slaves.
Oh, they could, yes.
Uh-huh.
But if they had free labour, the opportunity cost, you see. If you have opportunity cost and you did that with free labour, you get...
Oh, well, plainly they wouldn't have the slaves there, no.
Yeah, and the slaves would... Whoever was... Then they would make...
No, they'd have to pay more.
It could have been economic.
Oh, yeah.
The whole project could have been economic. It's just, by opportunity cost. You see, basically, opportunity cost is the thing that I didn't bring in, which I should have brought in, which I was going to bring in, when we start talking about why... And you see, for once I did talk that we should treat the slave as an individual. For once you've done that, you treat him as an end in Kant's view. In other words, then you take up, did it pay for him? So I do think that the sugar plantations would have been a going concern, but what they did is they used forced labour and they abused the slaves in that respect. But not perhaps by not feeding them well and so on.
But isn't that the thesis of the book, that it was a going concern?
Yes, but Smith says it was a going concern. Smith said that sugar... the thesis of the book is to refute Smith. Smith said that Smith's views of slavery is that it was a going concern with sugar and with other things. So the author agrees with Smith rather than refuting him on that.
But Smith thought that economics would end it, and he thinks that he took ethics and politics.
No. Smith thought that the state and the church would end it. He never thought that the economics would end it. Marx and Mises thought that the economics would end it.
Oh, I see. Okay, fine.
I just reading a few snippets on my way here to try and mug up on Adam Smith and slavery. I did see a quotation in which Smith is saying that he thinks that men's love of dominating one another is so great.
Yes.
That this is a prime motive for slavery.
Yes. I thought I said that.
You probably did. Sorry.
Yeah, that's his main idea. That's Smith's main idea, and that's the only reason why Smith thinks slavery exists. Because otherwise, if they didn't love this domination, you'd probably make more money out of sugar by free labour. You probably might.
On that land, you mean?
Yeah. This is why we've got the welfare state now, and the state, because of domination over other people.
Oh, well, I think that's part of it. That's the secret part of it, though. I think the upfront mistake of the welfare state is well-meaning. But of course the people do think most people don't like liberals because they think that liberals have got too rosy a view of the average person, even the average stupid person. The liberal view is the average stupid person can look after himself, and people don't like that.
Do I understand your conclusion then? You're saying essentially that the slavery is, as far as producing goods and so on, and benefiting the wider society. You seem to be accepting Fogel's case that in those terms it is productive and superior to free labour, but it just happens that it's extremely negative for the slaves themselves, and because of their subjective valuations. That's where it falls down.
That's where it fails economically, yeah. In other words, as I said towards the end, there's an economics of anything that exists. Everything that, including war, exists owing to an economic explanation, i.e. it's there, it maintains itself there. But whether it's doing so at the expense of something else, in the case of war, taxing the taxpayers and the general public, saying it's in their interest to fight in Iran and so on, whether that's really, when it's really in their interest to pay those taxes to fight in Iran, most libertarians would say no. It's whether it pays all round. Now, I think with slavery, the slaves have been abused, and their needs haven't been met as free individuals. So it isn't completely in a situation where it can be, where we can assess it economically. Because you've got to. Economics is basically satisfying the individual. Now, it may well satisfy him not so well, say for example, we work for low wages, or it may satisfy him very well if you work for high wages. But it is, the basic economic thing is, let's have the analogy with theft. A thief can exist, instead of with war, with theft. A thief can exist by robbing and by being very clever and getting away with it. Now, there is an economics to that theft. He's actually existing as a thief and he's robbing other people and so on and getting away with it. They don't know if he's got a mask or something. So he actually exists and he's going to... But the theft itself is not economic but catastrophic on economics. It's a negative-sum game, just like war. And slavery has got a large component of that running alongside it when it comes to the valuations of the slaves. And that, for that reason, Fogel takes the idea. I suppose Fogel would... My guess that Fogel, if he's still alive and in this audience now, would say, yes, crime does pay, otherwise it wouldn't happen and so on. And criminals are there and there's an economics to them. And in a sense, all that's true. So there is... What Fogel says about slavery in that respect is true. So I do agree with his facts. Slavery existed, they were profitable, they did he says at one stage, in the 18th century, half of the British fleet were carrying slave-made goods. So I think that's a fact. And these facts get quite impressive, but nevertheless you've got to have a look at the actual, whether it is really, when you're studying the economics, you've got to have a look at whether the economics is being done, and or whether there's what we might call externalities, or people are being forced to do things, like in this case the slaves. It's just like, if the Dreams were right on what they said, if industrialisation, say for example the Dreams were right on global warming and all that sort of stuff, and we really were getting rich at the expense of global warming, it's going to make the world, they said that the ice caps would melt in 2013, didn't they? Well, say for example that happened and the ice caps would melt in 2013, then the riches that we made would have been at the expense of the ice caps and so on. We might not bother about that, or we might, I don't know. But anyhow, that being external. Now, if the ice caps are, if there happen to be people, say people living on the ice caps and they collapsed or something, or it cost people something which they were forced, when it was imposed on them, then that would be a catastrophic diseconomy. I mean, in the case of war, when we go in and kill people in Iraq, we kill children and women and so on, that is uneconomic, plainly uneconomic. It's killing people instead of satisfying them. So there is a question of, in this, if slavery is economic, what is economics, basically? And I think, and you see, there's a sense in which he has a narrow definition of economics. I mean, the economics is just anything that exists as an economics to it, that's right. But is it profitable?
When people identify Adam Smith with the position that slavery is uneconomic and therefore was doomed.
But Smith didn't say that.
Explicitly, I mean...
Smith never said it was doomed. Smith quite explicitly says that it will always be there while there's goods that allow it to pay for it. In other words, he expects other things to replace sugar. He thinks it'll go on indefinitely unless it's outlawed.
Perhaps you should have spoken about Marx and Mises and left Adam Smith out of it. Then.
Oh no, because Smith is the target of this book.
It's a three-cornered fight for the audience.
Yeah. So that's basically saying that monopoly goods, or not monopoly, but near monopoly, are highly profitable commodity goods that there's a big profit margin on, can be used in that case. That's what you're saying. Smith was saying that funds the extra cost involved in the slave master, his own private perversion of wanting to control people.
Yes.
But in a free market, actually, against free people and free workers, that competition would actually drive down those prices and effectively drive those people out of business.
And that's exactly what Mises says, certainly. But it's not actually what Smith says.
Yeah.
So, yes, it's just a point of fact.
There's a point I'd like to raise. Who was the author of Freeing Slaves and Enslaving Free Men, the American economist?
Hummel.
Hummel. Well, he pointed out that a great deal of the cost of slavery was not borne by the slave owners, that people had to form a posse to track down slaves, whether they wanted to or not.
Yeah.
There were certain other costs that were borne by the taxpayer.
Yeah. And he also points out,
And he thinks without that it might not have lasted so long, for a start.
So the externalities, effectively, by socialising the externalities.
Well, so yeah, putting on others the costs of keeping the slaves and chasing them back. And
Hummel also points out that a lot of the gains of slavery wasn't borne by the owners as well. He reckons that, for example, the English workers getting cheap cotton shirts was a boon to the English workers. But yeah, that's what Hummel says. And that's the sort of thing that Fogel would say as well. Fogel says that when they outlawed slavery, it actually sent the standard of living down for the workers. Of course, in part of this fight up to the Civil War, these British freed the slaves in the 1830s, and the West Indies became something of a backwater afterwards. The West Indies did decline from being prosperous under slavery, and he was surprised at it at first, but now he's got his thesis. He's not surprised. This backs his sort of thesis up. He'd expect the West Indies, but he actually thinks that certain people in the northern side, or even in the abolitionist side, actually told lies about the West Indies. That they, I'm not sure they did. They probably didn't see the decline, but he reckons that they lied that the West Indies were more prosperous now they freed the slaves, because that was part of their outlook. I'm not sure they did, because people can be. I don't think these people lied about the USSR either. They had rosy tilted views of the USSR, and they actually did. I think someone like Shaw did actually probably expect the USSR to be better than it was, and just didn't see that it was backward.
Well, he was showing all of the tempting villages.
He's showing the best parts of it, yeah. And also he was. But actually, Shaw should have. Shaw's a strange chap, because Wigsteed, he had 3 years with Wigsteed. Now that's been a bit like having 3 years with Mises, perhaps even better. And so he should have seen through this. He should have seen through the USSR. I can't see what. But he just liked collectivism. It was a fashion.
Well, yes. I think it's time to call an end to the official part of the meeting, and I'd like to thank David. In closing, I should say that one form of slavery, perhaps still with us, though not regarded as such, is a form of slavery whereby the slave is allowed to go and work in the city. He can dress himself how he likes, he can go in and out how he likes, he can marry who he likes, but he has to send a certain percentage to the owner. Now called the Chancellor of the Exchequer, of course. Thank you, David. Thank you.
Yeah.